Hello. So, my name's George Gilbert. I'm a lecturer in modern Russian history at the University of Southampton, and I am recording the fourth of 5 planned clips on the Russian Revolution of 1917. So, I've spent a couple of clips outlining longer-term causes, talked about social and economic change, talked about the rise of political radicalism. Then I spent a clip briefly talking my way through some of the major events surrounding the revolution of 1905. And in the fourth of these clips, I want to talk about World War One. And I want to talk about it because it's very important to understanding what's to come in 1917. Now, a really big historical question, and one that historians really still don't really have much of a consensus on, is did the war, which in Russia lasts until 1917, did the war of 1914 to 17 cause the revolution of 1917? Now, in order to come up with an answer to that question, of course, we need to survey the developments, if only briefly. Historians generally divide the revolution into short-term and long-term causes. In recent years, scholars have viewed the revolution as a period rather than a singular event, with the war being crucial to understanding that period. So just to give you a few examples of this trend in historical writing, one of them is Mark Steinberg's recent book, The Russian Revolution, that lasts from 1905 to 1921. Steve Smith's book, Russian Revolution and Empire in Crisis, lasts from 1890 to 1928. And Orlando Fige's book, A People's Tragedy, lasts from 1891 to into the 1920s. On the other hand, you've got historians who generally stress the significance of 1917 itself. That's not to say that any of those scholars I've just mentioned don't think 1917 wasn't incredibly important, they do. But it's just that there are other ways of looking at the revolution that looks at the revolution as a singular event. The most important example of this literature, I think, is Alexander Rabinovich, When the Bolsheviks Come to Power, a book that is been around for some time, but is still extremely useful to understanding the revolution. And then there are books like China Mieville's recent book, October, that looks at each month of 1917 as a separate chapter in a month-by-month format. For those books that take the longer-term synoptic view, the war period of 1914-17 is extremely important. Following on from 1917, they often consider the Civil War era of 1918 to circa 1921 as being the kind of the other end, really, of the period. Some go further, though. As I mentioned, Steve Smith in his book Empire in Crisis looks up to the end of New Economic Policy, 1928. And an older book on the revolution by the very renowned historian Sheila Fitzpatrick talks of the Russian Revolution indeed as going up to Stalin's time, the early 1930s. Thinking about World War I specifically for now, we might think of why did Russia become involved in the First World War? And then we might think how World War I led to great transformations in Russian society. On the eve of the war, we see some interesting social developments in Russia. We can see that the strike movement, which had somewhat declined after 1905, started to go up again. In 1912, there were 2,032 strikes with 725,491 participants. In the first half of 1914, there were 3,534 strikes with 1,337,458 participants. By the latter year, moreover, the majority of these strikes had become political, and metal workers in the capital, a traditionally politically volatile group, were hugely represented by their percentage in the strike movement. The radicalisationist labour movement reaches a peak in July 1914 when the government fires on troops in the Putilov works in central St. Petersburg, killing 2 people. There had indeed been a recovery of the Social Democrats and Socialist Revolutionary groups before this era, but it was relatively modest. Thinking about wider labour unrest then, we can see before 1914 slight moves to maybe say there was more unrest, but civil society was still in some sort of paralysis. High politics had meanwhile continued to blunder along its normal course, and there was indeed much infighting in the Council of Ministers. There are therefore, thinking before World War I, some major trends in Russian society and politics that maybe suggest that some form of conflict could perhaps maybe cause great problems for Russia as it wasn't on an already certain footing. Thinking about First World War itself, Of course, Russia was, like all major belligerents, hugely impacted by the course of the war. Millions died from millions of combatants. Civilians, of course, lost their lives too in huge numbers after 1914. The war, of course, led to great changes in Russian life right from the start. From the rest of 1914, after the midpoint, we can see that military zones, together with vast swathes of territory behind front lines, were put under martial law. Commands at different levels had edicts to enforce security, prices were fixed, labour was requisitioned, and even pogroms, anti-Jewish riots, were stirred up against Jewish people who were considered to be shirking their military duty and as being non-Russian in their values. We also see in the early stages of the war that Russia doesn't do particularly well. It suffers several very serious military reverses. At the same time, enormous mobilisation is occurring in Russia itself. The number of men in the Russian armed forces in July of 1914 is uncertain. We can probably say it was around 1.5 million, but soon, given mobilisation of enormous reserves, it increased around 3 million. A very significant number of people. In the rear, of course, there are many organisations that are very important to the war effort. The Red Cross, the Zemstva, local councils, and doctors' organisations were all put on training for courses, and the salaries on offer proved to be quite attractive to people. Around half of Russia's wartime casualties were suffered in the first year of the conflict, from 1914 to 15, showing how immediately detrimental it was to the military and also the home front. Even so, there was enormous suggestions that there was an outburst of popular patriotism in the first months of the war in 1914 and into 15, which we also see in other major belligerents too. There's some excellent examples of this available to you on the internet. The British Library's collections with some open access items are worth exploring. One of them I frequently use in my own teaching, which is Arch Enemy, a Russian poster from 1915 depicting Kaiser Wilhelm II as a demonic creature. These kind of subhuman or bestial portrayals of the enemy belligerent are quite common, not just in Russia but in other major belligerents too during the course of the war. The social impact of war was of course enormous in Russia. There's a full-scale mobilisation which takes into account millions of people. Russia's railway network is stretched from the outset as well. There's indeed enormous population movement. There's refugee crisis. Peter Gattrell is one of a number of historians who've written on the very significant refugee crisis in Russia during the First World War in a very well-known monograph called A Whole Empire Walking. Much historical attention and writing has focused on the role of the home front in warfare in recent years. This is shown in great depth, the food shortages that many people had to suffer, the enormous rise in inflation caused by the shift from consumer goods to heavy industry. There's also much evidence that mobilisation curtails agricultural production. The condition of the peasantry, which is already extremely poor and parlous, worsens much during the course of the war itself. Much as in other major belligerents too, there's some interesting elements here and impacts on gender relations, with more and more women being called up for work and wartime labour. That's of course something that's not unique to Russia. There is indeed though some patriotism both in the field and indeed on the home front too. The reason for such sentiments were probably quite widespread. Pride in seeing one's regiment equipped itself with honour, disgust with cowardliness, those on one's own side, maybe a grudging admiration for the Germans, and also a dislike of the Germans, perhaps maybe for various reasons, maybe financial, political or others. Patriotism was often focused on family, on home, on the farm, and this indeed constitutes a microcosm of the nation, with soldiers feeling that they're defending their homeland, their patria, against a foreign assailant. It was considered by many of the more patriotic people in society that Russian soldiers had a somewhat special quality that separated them from their belligerents on the other side. Even so, considering all of this unrest, politics was relatively calm for the first year or so of the war, and then things changed in 1915, I should say. Before then, there's somewhat of a mood of national unity, but after this we see enormous change. We see great ministerial leapfrog in the people who are waging the war effort, frequent changes in personnel. We also see Nicholas II himself. He makes a decision when he appoints himself Commander-in-Chief of the Army in August 1915 that had enormous implications. Many historians have speculated, in my view correctly, this was a huge mistake as it tied him intimately to the failures in the field during the wartime crisis. At the same time, he left his wife Alexandra in charge as he was away on the front. This led, among other things, to many rumours about court intrigues, and indeed you can see on the internet for yourselves examples of different anti-Rasputin propaganda that circulated in Russia during the war years. Elsewhere, though, I think more significantly, you can see great ministerial change and unrest. From July 1914 to February 1917, there are no fewer than, for example, 4 prime ministers, 6 ministers of the interior, 4 ministers each of justice, war and agriculture, and 4 procurators of the Holy Synod, that is, in effect, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. There was continuous and compulsive interference in the government from the German-born Empress Alexandra Fedorovna, the wife of the Tsar, and indeed the influence of Rasputin, perhaps more symbolic than real, played a role in these ideas of court intrigues. At the same time, civil society played an enormous role in the running of the war effort, with many seizing an opportunity to consider what they considered patriotic work to expand the political influence of an important realm outside of the auspices of the government itself. The government welcomes the work of the Red Cross and organisations that offer assistance to many people, including refugees and women's organisations. But there's also a political challenge. The formation in June 1915 of a union of Zemstvos and urban municipalities known as Zemgor was something that was conducted without the Tsar's permission. We can see then the struggle of public organisations and the government occurring increasingly during and after 1915 itself. The economy was increasingly unbalanced to meet the needs of the armed forces, and it had an enormous impact and influence on the production of agriculture. And indeed, many other structural problems became increasingly accentuated during war. Food time shortages had become very acute by the winter of 1916, with many people increasingly quick to blame the government for this. Although I should of course say at this point that Russia is an enormous country and there was great regional differentiation. The outbreak of war had seen labour militancy collapse, but in the course of 1915-1916, Russia saw an increasing level of strike activity, far more than any other major belligerent power, and many of these strikes were strongly political in their complexion. And you can see from an earlier recording that balance between political and social and economic strikes is something that's important to bear in mind. We have then, therefore, multifaceted crisis even before February of 1917. We have unrest on the home front, political polarisation, uncertainty at home. We have uncertainty in the army and increasing criticisms on the home front of the waging of the wartime effort. Some of these political crises, of course, are very well known, such as the murder of Rasputin, but others indeed are more perhaps maybe mundane or everyday, which is not to say they're not in any way extremely important. The rise of labour militancy and increasing criticisms of the waging of the war effort as the war drags on are very important things to bear in mind when we think about why 1917 occurred. At this point then, I'm going to stop the recording, and then in the 5th and final recording, I'll look very briefly at 1917 itself.